This week on Q&A, our guest is Fred Grandy, former Republican congressman from Iowa. He's currently the host of a radio talk show called The Grandy and Andy Morning Show on WMAL in Washington, D.C., and on the web at WMAL.com.
Fred Grandy, I want you to grade the following four things in your life.
Okay.
From the purpose, for the purpose of what gave you the most satisfaction.
So we're talking about 4 grades or an aggregate grade?
No. All right, let's start.
Okay.
Actor, Gopher on Love Boat. How satisfying was that?
Oh, satisfaction index, solid B.
Member of the United States Congress for 4 years.
B minus.
Head of Goodwill Industries for 5 years.
A minus.
Talk show host, Washington, D.C., WMAL today.
B plus.
We'll come back to all that.
Okay, all right.
Let's look at what it's like to be in your studio when you start off in the morning.
Okay.
WMAL Washington, FM 107.3 WRQX HD2 worldwide. 630 WMAL.com. 630 WMAL. Plant at 9, Rush at noon, Hannity at 3, and Levin at 6. Listen all day and be stimulated. Yeah! Now, Grandy and Andy on the news. You've
been doing this for how long?
Let's see. I started at WMAL in 2003. So this is really my 7th year, and I have Saddam Hussein to thank for the job.
Why?
Well, because I had been out in California. I was kind of between careers at that point. And I had filled in for Chris Core, who used to be on our show on our station as a talk show host from time to time when I was still at Goodwill. And the guy who was the general manager, because of the war effort ramping up in Iraq, wanted to go to more full 24/7 coverage of the war, have more commentators, more people on the microphone. And he asked me to fill in. So I started doing more work because I wasn't at Goodwill anymore, and I'd just come back from California and Nevada where I'd been doing some acting work actually. And I kind of gravitated to it, kind of following the war. And it so happened, this would have been March of 2003, and by June of 2003, a slot had opened up on this morning program that my colleague Andy Parks had been doing for years. And the general manager, Chris Berry, said, would you be interested in doing this? Carefully deleting the part about getting up at 2 in the morning. So I said, hey, that sounds kind of interesting. And so I started, and I've been there ever since. It would be June of 2003.
The time of day you're on?
5 to 9, Monday through Friday.
The listening area that you go to?
Well, it would be the greater metropolitan area of Washington, probably as far north as outskirts of Baltimore, as far south maybe as, Warrenton, places like that.
We took our cameras to your studios this week. Here's a segment where you and Andy were talking about Haiti.
When I was a member of Congress in 1988, Pat Robertson made his first foray into Iowa and successfully co-opted the Republican Party.
Yes, he did.
And I was in the forefront of that revolution because I said then, this guy is a formidable presence. Mm-hmm. I would like to now say he is an idiot. He is more moron than Messiah. And I got to tell you.
Maybe you're not a good judge of character based on what you just told me.
Let me just tell you, I am offended as a Christian about this. You know what? Because this has got nothing to do with Christianity. It's got everything to do with colonialism.
Look.
This guy ought to take his ministry to the Sci-Fi Channel. That is an example of being cursed. Then, how did communism exist for 80 years? Did the devil not hate that? The premise is by Robinson. By the way, this is a racist remark, too. You understand that. Because these were black slaves revolting against what they called a white god.
Wait a minute. I didn't take race away from the comments of Pat Robertson.
Well, it is. It's inherently racist. It is the most racist remark we've heard this week, Harry Reid included. It is.
Fred.
It is absolutely racist. It is absolutely racist.
You are really offended by this.
I am totally offended by this as a Christian and as a recovering Republican and on a whole variety of levels.
How much of that is planned?
None. None of that is planned. As a matter of fact, we had probably said to ourselves, because we have a meeting between 4 and 5 when we go on, which is a kind of editorial meeting as to what the stories would be. And we really had not planned to stress the Haitian catastrophe until Robertson said what he said, because he said we really said this is a story for the national news. It doesn't lend itself to talk value until Robertson said what he said. And I'm absolutely honest, I was furious about that. As a guy who admires Pat Robertson as a religious leader and as a political architect, I was in Iowa when he finished second in 1988. And I was one of the few people that said, you know what, I actually think he could pull this off. And his coalition, the Christian coalition, stayed in that state and built what became a kind of the prototype for the conservative Republican Party, rightly or wrongly. But having said that, I looked at that and I said, this is so wrong on so many levels. And believe me, we get a lot of response on our show, emails, Twitter responses, and Facebook, and phone calls. And I got equally hammered and lauded for what I said. And that usually is an indication that talk radio is working, when people are furious and ebullient.
What's the relationship between you and Andy Parks, who sits across from you? And I'm talking a number of things: personal relationship, show relationship, and political relationship.
In terms of kind of the Republican spectrum, obviously we're both conservatives. Andy is the Shiite and I'm the Sunni. I say I'm probably just right of center, and he is way right of center. And it's surprising the number of times we mix it up over things like this. I found myself to be the more conservative on this particular issue, because I really felt religion had no place in this particular discussion. I did not know Andy really at all until I started on the show. We're very compatible and good colleagues, but we really only see one another at work. And again, when you get up at 2 in the morning and you work until about 10 or 10:30, that's plenty. I mean, we probably wind up seeing more of ourselves than we do our spouses because of our rather anti-diurnal lifestyle. But all of that having been said, it's a partnership that I think works pretty well.
I listen a lot, and I know that you talk a lot about being a former congressman, but here's an example on the healthcare issue this week where you actually got into the weeds, and I want to ask you what kind of relationship you have with your audience over these kind of things.
Okay.
And Nancy Pelosi, I think, at least up to this point, has been very successful in holding coalitions together when she absolutely positively had to be there. Now, guys that voted against this include Bart Gordon, John Tanner, Brian Baird, all Blue Dog Democrats who are leaving. Now that they're no longer running for re-election, you have to say, they're going to be looking this and saying, what am I going to get if I vote aye? Would I get some kind of administration appointment? Quite possibly. Would I get some kind of K Street job? Possibly. Yeah, I mean, there are conditions far beyond the relative merits of this health care bill that factor into this decision. It is more than a math problem. It is a problem of who are you going to believe. If Nancy Pelosi can convince, and she would use people like Steny Hoyer and the head of the DCCC to say, look, I know you're going to make a tough vote here. She'd be talking to some of those Southern Democrats who joined the Democratic Party in 2006 and 2008, who now make up their coalition, who have a real problem with this because their districts are opposed to it. Okay, if past is prologue here, Nancy Pelosi would say, "Don't worry, we will protect you." If you believe that, you'll vote aye.
Right.
But almost always there are 2 or 3 casualties. Will it be enough? We'll see.
511 at WMAL.
When you get into the details like that, you get any response from your audience like saying, get off it, we want, less serious stuff?
No, you find when you do talk radio, particularly conservative talk radio, you've got a fairly educated crowd, people that have already begun to do their own homework. And most of the people that call into our show will know the players as well as the plays. They'll know Nancy Pelosi. They'll know Steny Hoyer. They might even know Chris Van Hollen, who is the head of the DCCC. They will know the committee chairs like Waxman and Rangel and Barney Frank, Financial Services, because they are, I call them devotees, others might call them junkies, but they are policy geeks like myself. And they like that level of detail. Now that's not the full audience, but when you are really talking to a crowd that is politically tuned and biased, they usually have chapter and verse to back up their creed. So I'm not just doing this as a former member, I'm doing this because I think those kinds of details, this is something that Andy and I get into a lot. Andy has always been an amateur and a bystander when it came to the political process, and of course gets angrier and angrier by the moment. He gets particularly upset with me when I start talking about the process of politics, because he says, well, why do politicians behave this way? And my answer is usually, it's because they can. And this is how coalitions are made, and sometimes it's not pretty, as both Republicans and the Democrats know. But when it comes down to getting the final votes, a lot of what you would consider to be principle and political belief goes out the window. I mean, you're talking about some of these newer members of Congress. If you've got a guy in a district who may have won 51-49 and it's going to be a tough vote on health care, if you're Nancy Pelosi, you say, how'd you like to be on energy and commerce next year? How about a seat on appropriations? Your district could use some money, right? And believe me, that resonates.
Is that right or wrong? I mean, good or bad, I guess, would be the better question.
I don't know how that's any different than the kind of deal you would make between two people trying to settle a lawsuit or two companies trying to merge. It's up to the individual member. You know, if somebody says, you know what, Madam Speaker, I would like nothing better than to be a member of the Ways and Means Committee, but I'd also like to be a sophomore in the body next year. And not only that, my constituents don't believe this is a good bill.
How many people listen to you every morning?
Aggregate number?
Yeah.
Oh wow, Brian, that's hard to know because.
Where do you fit in with 40 radio stations in town?
Well, in our area, we are usually somewhere in the top 15. We are somewhere between, let's say 7 and 15 normally, and the ratings now come out monthly. The system of measuring radio, Arbitron, has. They would say it's upgraded. I'd say it's just become more complicated.
How often do you get a former member of Congress, or no, I'm a current member of Congress, say to you, I'm listening?
Oh, pretty regularly. I mean, there are guys, for example, Joe Wilson, when he became instantly notorious after shouting, "You lie" to the president, we went after him to come on the show. It turned out he listened to the show. So there are quite a few members who kind of tune in on a regular basis. Frank Wolf, who is a local Northern Virginia congressman, is a regular listener.
You can listen to it on the internet.
Sure.
Every morning.
Anywhere in the world, for that matter.
WMAL, click on, there you are.
630WMAL.com.
You get much feedback from around the world, and you get any calls from around the world?
We do. I would say around the country. We haven't had too many calls from around the world. But you know, radio as a broadcast medium is changing as rapidly as everything else in communication technology. And I would say we're probably 5 years away from getting rid of what we used to call radio towers, because I think we'll be broadcasting entirely over the internet. If the new technology that will allow you to have the internet in your car becomes fairly commonplace, as I suspect it will, there'll be no difference between AM and FM. And the big loser here may wind up being satellite radio, because that was a technology designed to kind of offer an alternative to the old broadcast modulations. And now you're going to be listening online. I
know in my own case, I can listen to a liberal talk show host and a conservative on XM radio side by side, click back and forth. I listen to you, and our radio station is carried on an iPod.
Sure.
I mean, on an iPhone. An app.
Well, we just got an application for WMAL, so you can listen on your cell phone as well. And of course we podcast, so you know we try and stay as close to the cutting edge of technology as we can.
What do you know from experience of 7 years of doing this works for the audience? And I'm really talking about the confrontation between you and Andy.
Oddly enough, one of the most profound statements about doing radio in Washington, D.C. came from, wait for it, Howard Stern, okay, who was not normally associated with political commentary. But when he was here, for the time he said, you know, despite all of the hoopla about the Beltway and the Pentagon and the kind of elite patronage that is part Congress, part K Street, part administration appointees, the real listener in radio in the Washington, D.C. area is Louis from Bowie, Maryland. And he's right. There are a lot of people that may be close to the process but not actually in it. And they're still pressing their face against the glass the way everybody else does in this country who doesn't quite get politics. So that really is the listener. It is perhaps marginally more sophisticated, marginally more educated, and for that hardcore conservative crowd, perhaps they're a little more finely attuned to the process. But most people turn in because they're curious or upset as to why it's not working the way it should. So it's no different really than their car or their air conditioner.
You got into it this week, the two of you, over the question of would we be better off if Senator McCain had become president?
Yeah.
Let's listen to a little bit.
Here's the thing.
Yeah.
You and we had this for discussion in the 5 o'clock hour, and I was astonished there were so many people that agreed with you.
Yes.
Come
yes,
on,
Fred.
At some point, you have to take what you can get, and McCain, as the president, would
Gitmo.
not necessarily.
Gitmo. He wanted to close Gitmo.
Yes, he did.
Okay. So what would be the difference? Okay.
The difference would be you would not be seeing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed going to New York for a civilian trial.
I'm not sure of that.
That is the difference.
I'm not sure of that.
I will bet you any amount of money he would never agree
Hey,
to
look,
that.
this
I
way-
never
look,
heard
look.
McCain utter one word about saying military tribunals were wrong for
Look,
these guys.
Obama's in the White House. You got both houses. Democrat. Look, it's all on them. It's all on them.
Yes, but if you have a Republican president, and this George H.W. Bush knew this, you got the power of the veto. And you can use it. I mean, Gerald Ford built his entire presidential career, short as it was, around having the veto. Okay? Well, at least he stopped a lot of stuff that shouldn't have happened.
WMAL News Time, 8:14.
Yeah, I want to be careful not to characterize it incorrectly, but as a listener, sometimes Andy goes off very strongly.
Yeah, he does.
And he represents often the average conservative in this country, it seems to me.
Who's angry at the process, Republican or Democrat.
Everything now is in the Democrats' corner, right? Yes. Everything.
Yeah.
All right, so let them go ahead and do what they're going to do, and if they screw up, then it's their fault, right? McCain would be nothing but a sounding board for them.
You're not there, though. You're in some other world.
No, I mean, I describe myself after I left Congress as a recovering congressman. And part of that is knowing how the process works, knowing I was part of the process, sometimes apologizing for it, but also trying to explain it to a degree. And in the case of a guy like John McCain, I mean, even as devout a conservative as Rush Limbaugh has owned up to the fact that he voted for McCain because he thought it would marginally be better. And let's face it, I mean, you've, and I have been around this town long enough to know that the real policy decisions are in the margins between right and left, the ones that sustain. And that is perhaps a decision that doesn't sit well with people that are ardently on the right and left. And Andy is one of those guys on the right, and he would have loved to have Fred Thompson be elected the President of the United States. Unfortunately, Fred Thompson didn't run a campaign that got him really out of the starting gate. And so consequently, when you get down to the choices you've got, it's got to be the universe you live in, not the one that you would pray for.
When I asked you up top of the show, the grade you'd give, you gave Goodwill Industries A-. Mm-hmm. This experience now a B+, Congress a B-. Mm-hmm. I hear you trash Congress.
I do.
Why?
Because I was disappointed in the promise and the practice. The most, I think, exciting moment I had as a member of Congress was before I even got there, the night of my first election victory. And I was, as I'm sure a lot of new members are, full of hope and change, to use a common term, about what I could do. And I arrived in 1987 and served until 95, saw 3 presidents come and go, remained in the minority, but felt, I was able to kind of split the difference between being a minority member and an effective member. But by the time I left, I felt as though the process was to some degree imploding on itself, and it was not getting as much done as it claimed it could. And although it seems trivial now, we argued about deficit spending back then. Of course, it's nowhere near in the league it is now, but it was enormously frustrated for me, because you got to understand, I came out of a show business background, and rightly or wrongly, successful endeavors in show business, whether they're stage plays or television shows or movies, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Public policy, and particularly Congress, is always in the middle. It's between stuff. And so there was a sense that nothing is ever completed. And that's why I think I gave it, just barely an honors mark, because there are a lot of very honorable people in the system, but the product doesn't seem to reflect their individual and collective efforts.
You say you get up at 2 in the morning.
Yes.
What time do you go to bed?
Sometime between 6 and 7, which is the worst part of it, because it's like being sent to bed, What does that say about a marriage when your wife sends you to bed at 6:30 in the evening? And it does play a certain amount of havoc with your system. I mean, I as I said earlier, I'm more nocturnal than diurnal now, not by choice, but just by kind of chemistry and biology. And I find myself kind of with a quasi jet lag on the weekends, because I don't know when I'm waking and sleeping. So there's a consequence to this. Now, for a guy like Andy, who has done this all of his life, I think he's been on the air and doing morning radio for well over 20 years. He said early on when I asked him about it, he said, you never get used to it, but you get used to not getting used to it. And that's kind of true, although I'm still not sure I'm getting used to not getting used to it.
Now, he drives how far every day to get to the studio?
He lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, he lives out in Carroll County, and I believe his drive each way is 52 miles. And he's always done it. But, we prepare different ways. He gets in his car and drives for an hour and listens to a variety of radio stations and briefs himself on the topics that we'll probably be talking about by listening to stories. While he's doing that, I'm on the internet, usually going through probably an itinerary that includes maybe 7 or 8 various news sites, chat sites, pulling very much the same stories. So the way that we come together when we have our editorial meeting is I have the stories, I have the details, I may have some facts and figures. He's got sound bites. I mean, he's heard some things and he knows where to get them. So for a radio show, it's a pretty good mix.
I hear you cite 3 things on a regular basis: the Wall Street Journal, Drudge, and the Washington Post.
Yes. In addition to that, I would also include Politico. I would include USA Today.
They used to own that station, didn't they? WMAL? Did they? No, that was television. They own the television station.
Yeah.
But
I will also use Real Clear Politics, sometimes for a little kind of editorial spin, and CNN.com. I mean, I try and graze right and left when I'm looking for the coverage of the stories, because a lot of what we do is commentary about the news, not just the news.
You're talking with Andy about the Massachusetts Senate race, which is up in a couple of days. Let's listen to this.
WMAL News Time 526. It's Andy Parks, Fred Grandy, and Brian Neiman.
Mr. Chairman, it occurs to me that in our capacity as right-wing nut jobs, and in our as we have tried to elevate the status of Scott Brown's candidacy for the Senate in Massachusetts, we have not been completely fair to Martha Coakley. because, as you know, she said that we should pull out of Afghanistan because there are no terrorists there, and there would.
Right.
I think you could draw a conclusion that she's soft on terrorism and probably on crime. If she thinks they're not there, then obviously she doesn't have any kind of action she's going to take against them. This is not true. She apparently has picked her enemies very carefully as Attorney General of Massachusetts, and she doesn't have time for terrorists because she is actively cracking down on garden clubs in Massachusetts.
She is.
A troublemaking bunch if there ever was
I'm
one.
telling you, you gotta watch 'em.
Evidently, this is in the Wall Street Journal this morning. She's apparently going after garden clubs for not filing their nonprofit status properly. So she's sending all these angry letters to these little groups that maintain traffic islands, part of the beautification.
Yeah.
They make between $5,000 and $10,000 a year in various dues and plant sales and stuff. This is the enemy that must be stopped now. Not Abdul Muttalib, not Khalid Sheikh Mohammed,
Nope.
not anybody
The
in
garden
Afghanistan.
clubs.
The garden clubs.
What role does humor play?
Well, I think it's what makes our show different from all the other kind of commentary. I mean, angry radio only works if there is, I think, a way to leaven it a little bit, and there's almost an instinctive reaction among the two of us. And I guess I would include Brian Neiman in that as well.
Tell us who Brian Neiman is.
Brian Neiman is our news guy. He's the guy that we're constantly beating up on as somebody who is lacking our experience and gravitas. If you were going to describe this show, these three people on this show, as people driving to work, like everybody listening to this show, Andy would be in the driver's seat. I would be sitting next to him as the navigator with maps and guidebooks, and Neiman would be in the back seat asking, "Are we there yet?" Okay, that's kind of the dynamic. But Neiman is obviously younger than we are. As I said, he's about my son's age, about 36 years old, and so the whole idea is to be very serious about the topic, but not so serious about ourselves, so that there is not always a certain kernel of humor in almost everything that we do. So if Andy gets very angry about something, I will try and find something that is amusing about it. And similarly, like for example with the Pat Robertson thing we talked about, Andy was amused by my ire. I'm frequently amused by his ire when he is terribly upset about something.
Do you two ever get mad at each other seriously over
No,
an issue?
not ever seriously. Professionally, yeah, we'll have disagreements, but there is never a time where anger turns into hostility. Maybe that's the difference between us and the United States Congress now. We still knock off at 9 o'clock and all is forgiven. And that's very important to maintain a relationship over time on the air.
In your life is Sioux City, Iowa.
Yeah.
We born there?
Mm-hmm. That's where I'm from.
Harvard, a serious place.
Yeah.
Gopher for 9
A
years.
serious role. The chief executive officer, of course, the chief financial officer.
First name Burl.
Yeah.
And a radio show, well, Congress, of course.
Yeah.
And then a radio show that has both serious and some humor in it.
And of course, nestled in there is also running one of the largest nonprofit charities in the world.
And by the way, you gave that an A-, which
Yes.
was your top grade of the 4 jobs we talked about. Why?
Because that was, in my view, the full expression of what I thought public service was supposed to be. Congress was the debate side of public service. Goodwill Industries was the delivery side, and it just so happened, and this was fortuitous, that I was able to follow what I started as a member of Congress, particularly a member of the Ways and Means Committee, on welfare reform, which was just beginning to find its legs when I left the House. Follow that to the delivery side when I went to Goodwill Industries, which began and then very rapidly accelerated the process of welfare to work. You know, when Clinton succeeded in changing an entitlement into a block grant and essentially parceling out training and education and employment to organizations like ours, Goodwill, which had been marginally involved in training low-income, undereducated workers as well as people with cognitive and physical disabilities, we got deeply into that And it was very helpful for me to go from what I called the debate side of public service to the delivery side, because I could actually see people going to work, people that had been considered not just hard to train, but impossible to train. People who were considered not just unemployed, but unemployable. And there was a sense at Goodwill that this is what the full realization of public policy is supposed to be about, actually working in a community. That's the only place I really ever saw that.
And you did
once
that
I
for
left Congress.
5 years.
About 5 years.
How big an organization is that, by the way?
Well, it depends on whether you're measuring it by revenue or...
Try revenue.
Well, I would say now that the donated goods business is probably a couple of $2 billion a year, and I would say that 90% of that revenue, if not more, probably 95%, goes into services. So I always measured it by the number of people we served. And of course, Goodwill, being a franchise operation, has chapters all over the United States and Canada. But I would say in any given year now, we're probably serving 250, 300,000 people in some capacity or another.
Another thing in your resume that pops out of the page is the former roommate of David Eisenhower.
Years
and
ago.
You were in his wedding.
Mm-hmm.
Explain all that
As
to
he
us.
was in mine. Well, we wound ourselves up accidentally as roommates because we both got sent off to the Phillips Exeter Academy as freshmen when we were 13 years old. And it was a luck of the draw. I mean, there was no reason I was his roommate, except perhaps for what was usually considered to be geographical distribution. He was from Pennsylvania, I was from Iowa. And unlike a lot of kids that are forced to share a small living space, we actually got along pretty well and roomed together for 4 years. Then he went off to Amherst and I went off to Harvard, and he got married and I got married, and we kept in touch. He came out and campaigned for me when I first ran for Congress, and also when I ran for governor in '94.
That was in the primary.
Yeah, when I ran in the primary. And then we kind of, we keep in touch. He's actually the godfather to my oldest child. But it was one of those things where we kind of, we drifted apart, but when you know somebody that long, maintaining constant contact is not critical to the relationship.
What impact did Phillips Exeter Academy have on your life? And where is it?
Well, Phillips Exeter Academy is, I suppose, one of the oldest private boarding schools in the United States, in Exeter, New Hampshire. And I got sent there because my two brothers and my father went there, so it was obviously legacy type stuff. But the most important thing for me there was that's where I learned how to learn. And it is probably, moment for moment, the best education I ever had, because it was about never any more than 12 or 15 kids, all boys at that time, it's co-ed now, sitting around a table, a long, oblong table, with a teacher, with a professor, and using a very Socratic form of learning. And so it really influenced everything I ever did. I mean, I learned how to, prosecute and defend Macbeth, or, logarithms, or the Peloponnesian War, or whatever, through this process. And it was enormously valuable in everything I ever did.
Wasn't that the same path that Robert Todd Lincoln took?
I guess so.
Phillips Exeter Academy to Harvard?
I hadn't thought about that, but I guess you're probably right. I'll have
'Cause
to
I
go back and
remember
read that part of Doris Kearns' book, I guess.
But his father went to the Cooper Union thing to make a couple $100 to help him get into Phillips Exeter, I believe.
Oh, you're right about that. You're
so
right.
that he could go to Harvard.
And the same process still works, by the way. I mean,
Back to the radio show.
Yeah.
Use of humor, talking about Senator Levin and Yemen. Let's watch that.
I do not think the United States, or any country for that matter,
Hey, look, Levin
can take a shot into a foreign country because they think there's a bad guy there.
Levin even said he would expect quiet permission from Yemen's government.
Now, there is this, Neiman. You can say, we thought we had permission.
Yeah,
There was a
right.
miscommunication.
That always works.
Okay, I guess I was misquoted or misunderstood, not mistaken. I mean, politicians are expert at that.
Oh, did I say
So-
Yemen? I thought it was Yellowstone. I
Yeah.
read that wrong.
Yeah.
They both started with a Y.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. I thought we were talking about the Florida Peninsula. Oh well.
Whoops. Sorry about that.
How about this? The official American response. My bad.
Now, where do you pick up on current day slang like "my bad"?
Well, I live in current day. I mean,
But I mean, how do you stay in touch with a younger group?
Well, it helps to have 3 children between the ages of 35 and 21. But again, I guess because I always came out of an entertainment background, I try and stay current with television, with movies, with show business news. Not so much music. I kind of fall down in that category. I'm not too hip when it comes to pop music. But I've always been fascinated in the kind of variations of American speech, the slang, the patois, the vernacular, what's hot, what's not, terms that come in and out of vogue. So, and in radio, you want to sound a lot like the people who listen to you, so you don't estrange yourself from your audience. Don't forget, when you're talking to a microphone, you're talking to one person. It's called broadcasting, but really, I've always thought that it's like you and I. I'm talking to you, you're talking to me. Behind us, there is hopefully a large audience. But you don't address them as such. That's why you'll never hear, or almost rarely will you hear Andy and I speak to our microphone, say, ladies and gentlemen, folks. Limbo will do that. Others will do that. But I've always considered it to be a one-on-one relationship. And it's that kind of intimacy that I think argues for a more contemporary, popular, even slang-oriented speech.
You're on a radio station that has Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Mark Levin,
right?
And the Coast to Coast at Night, and then the Midnight Radio Network, which is a couple conservatives out of Dallas, Texas.
Sure.
Mostly conservative radio, and Chris Plant, the local fellow.
Very conservative.
Why does conservative radio appear to work so much better than liberal radio?
People have written treatises about that, and I guess from my experience as a guy that's been a candidate, an office holder, a policymaker, and to some degree, and now I guess I'd call myself an infotainer. It seems that conservative talk seems to get closer to the average American dilemma than does the liberal argument. And I say this as a guy who obviously went to Harvard and to Hollywood and was in the House of Representatives, which I will sometimes say on the speaking circuit, the 3 great liberal pest holes of the United States. And I found when I went back to Iowa and tried speaking like I was a Harvard graduate or a guy who was very well educated, I couldn't communicate very well. And I didn't quite understand what it was to run, in my case, a small farm or a small business, of course, which is one and the same, or to raise a family without nannies or staff. And a lot of the public policy, and I guess what is now called the kind of progressive agenda, take, for example, healthcare, is designed to improve your lot whether you like it or not. And I think one of the things that resonates about talk radio when it's well done, and it's not always well done. I mean, there are some people who are good at this and some people who are not. But when it kind of gets to where you live, when it sounds like you're talking to somebody over a kitchen table and not a congressional dais, it works well. And to me, that's why a guy like John Kerry could not ever be elected president, because he always seemed to be kind of emphasizing how smart he was, how erudite he was. And with very few exceptions, we don't elect people like that. I'm not quite sure whether Obama is an example of that or whether he will run counter to that.
Here comes the fun stuff.
Okay.
Television.
What have we been doing up to this
Television
point?
history. Oh,
okay.
serious.
All right.
Deadly
Okay. All right.
serious.
Fine.
Here is a little bit of your 9 years.
Love won't hurt anymore. It's an open smile.
Captain Stubing.
What's he done to you today?
It's not just today. It's all the time. It's always, Gopher, get a haircut. Gopher, do this. Gopher, do that. I'll bet you that on every given cruise, he says, Gopher, do something at least 20 times.
How big a bet?
$50.
I'll take that bet. You got it?
Me too.
Report back in 10 minutes. Gopher!
That's one. I'm going to clean up this cruise.
That seems 100 years ago to me.
Yeah, you did that for 9 years.
4 or 5 lives ago. Yeah.
I don't remember what grade you gave that. Was it a B?
Yeah, it was a B.
And so it's not the best, not the worst.
No, the reason, first of all, I don't think people realize who are not in the business how enormously difficult it is to succeed. I mean, I've got two older children in show business right now. And even though, obviously, they are, to some degree, beneficiaries of my success, I scrupulously stayed out of trying to counsel them as to whether they should do this or not, because the only way you find out is to go out and do it and find out whether you sink or swim. It's one of those things where you have to be good enough to be in the right place at the right time, but it's an enormous kind of almost cosmic mix of talent and luck, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time when I was in my early 20s, because that's when I first got on that show.
We found something on, of all things, Polish television that we thought you might enjoy. Polish television, there it is.
You're the Nile, you're the Tower of Pisa,
You're the smile on the Mona Lisa. I'm a worthless check,
a total wreck of fun.
but if baby I'm the bottom,
But if baby I'm the bottom,
but if baby I'm the bottom, you're the top.
That was on TVP2.
Okay, well, I'll take your word
with
for it.
Polish translation, obviously a Gopher show with Ethel Merman.
We never took a cruise to Warsaw or Krakow, so I never got to see it. But I will say this, of all the people, and one of the great dividends of being on that show for 8 years was I met just about everybody who was anybody in show business, including Ethel Merman, who, as you know, played my mother on that show. And, you know, of all of the people I met, I would say the two people that I had the most profound impact with were Ethel Merman and Don Amici, who never did Love Boat, but because of Love Boat, I did a summer tour of How to Succeed in Business in Ohio and St. Louis. And Don Amici, you know, I played J. Pierpont Finch and he played Bigley. And so we toured together. And you know, I don't remember really liking acting that much. I mean, I liked it, but I wasn't one of those guys who had to act. But the great dividend of being on that show was meeting all these people and picking up their stories and learning about them and, you know, to some degree having casual friendships with them.
What was the accident that burned you?
We were on location in the Mediterranean. And we happened to be in a little Turkish seaside resort town called Kuşadası, which I guess is technically part of Asia Minor back in the day. And we were attending a soiree, I think put on by local government officials. And at one point, a bunch of cast members and myself decided to leave and go back to the ship, and we had party balloons that we decided to take with us. And I was smoking at the time. I used to smoke quite a bit. And as we piled into the car, I put the balloons in the car, and my cigarette brushed against one of them, and it popped. Well, of course, party balloons are filled with helium, which is an inert gas. But not in Turkey. They fill their party balloons with hydrogen. I don't know. They must. Maybe it's part of their defense strategy. You never know when the Greeks are going to show up. So, so anyway, the car exploded. I mean, the flames shot 6 feet in the air, and I was profoundly burned in my face and hands. And it was that kind of flirtation with mortality that got me thinking about what I really wanted to do with my life, and sent me back to Iowa and put me in a whole different kind of life choice than just kind of serving myself, which is, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, show business is a great life if you can make a go of it. But it became profoundly less gratifying after that accident. And it's about that time I started thinking about, is there some other use for what I thought my vaunted communication skills were at the time?
We will leave the entertainment world in just a moment, but
Okay.
there are a few other roles that you played in your life that we must experience.
All right, fine.
Let's watch.
The show on TV.
Waltons.
No, Sherman Hemsley, The Black Family.
Good Times, Jefferson.
Right. Okay. A picture of your face is a...
Portrait.
Right. Okay. Kith and...
Kin.
$1,000 bonus and the win. David, you didn't do badly at all.
My name's Walt. I work as night watchman here at Fred's Wax Museum to put myself through criminology college. It used to be very lonely until recently when I plugged in my crime computer. Suddenly, oscillating vibrations brought to life 3 legendary monsters. Dracula, the werewolf, and Frankenstein. Creatures hated and feared for centuries, now determined to make up for their past misbehaving by fighting crime wherever they find it. Together, we're the Monster Squad.
Here she is, that adorable swastika sweetheart, Matilda the Hun from Milwaukee, and her lovable Nazi navigator, Herman the German Fox. Matilda, Herman, do you think this is your turn to be first and foremost in sunny California?
Today, California.
Tomorrow, the world.
Hiya, Herman. I hope your buzz bomb has a little more juice in its warhead this year.
Herman.
Of course, those were my own clothes.
Herman the German?
Herman the German in Death Race 2000, a movie I made for Roger Corman, back in 1977 or 78. They, just to give you a little history on how successful Roger Corman was. We shot the movie, I believe, in 3 weeks. They cut it in 4, released it in 5, and made the money back in 6. They did every single location at a speedway in Pasadena. And I think they did, the Ontario Speedway, they did all the exteriors and all the interiors were at the Pasadena Civic Center. But, it was work back then. But of course, I never thought I would be so mortified publicly as being.
Did you ever get mad at either journalists or interviewers or people in politics when they would bring up the showbiz thing when you're in the middle of being a congressman?
No, you know why? Because it was, I always lived in the house that Gopher built. I mean, I would not have had a shot had I not done that. And of course now the entertainment world is essentially a glide path. The best comment on that I ever heard was Sonny Bono, who was elected to the House after I left. But I knew Sonny from television, and we would talk from time to time. And we would sometimes commiserate about, entertainment people going into politics. And the question I always got was, do you have a problem with actors becoming politicians? Because I had come to the House not long after Reagan had been elected president. And Sonny, I was talking to Sonny about this. He said, that's not the problem. The problem is politicians becoming actors. And that is even more profound now than it was then, which was a comment that he made about 20 years ago.
Back to the radio show. Ann Wogue.
Our producer.
Your producer.
Yeah.
Here's a little bit of what she does and tell us how she fits in the program.
WMAL, do you want to talk to Grandy and Andy? What would you like to say?
I don't understand.
So when Fred says he's offended, are you offended or not offended?
All right, back to the phones.
I appreciate your integrity, Fred, to really denounce being said.
Okay, so wait a minute, hold on, Justin. So Jeremiah Wright, what he said wasn't nonsense?
Andy, you should be ashamed of yourself, but I know you're not.
You're exactly right. I am not, Justin. Thanks for the call. Appreciate it. Mike in Gaithersburg.
You cut off my guys. Wow, okay.
Hi, Mike.
It is warped theology. It is offensive, but it is in no way racist. When Jeremiah Wright talks, he outright calls it white America. He did not say that's black Haiti. And the other thing is, they say the same thing of any country that is out blatantly against the gospel, like Saudi Arabia or any of those countries. When anything happens there, they say the same thing. Oh, it's cursed by God. So it's just warped theology, but it's in no way racist.
Talking about Pat Robertson, but go back to Ann Wogue.
Well, Ann is our producer, and that is a critical job because I don't know if they showed you, but in addition to doing the call screening, which is very important, because as important as the calls she puts up are the calls she doesn't allow. So that is the gate through which all comment much pass, and there are people who are good at it and people who are bad. Plus, she every morning provides a list of stories which can be 6 or 7 pages long with little blurbs as to what our content should be. So she's very much a part of the editorial meeting. And, given the kind of small network, she kind of runs the Montessori school that we're all part of. I mean, she kind of keeps us on track. Sometimes you might get a little bit too far out in one direction, and she can help bring us back. She had a very successful career in Seattle. The guy who was the program director, Paul Duckworth at WMAL, had been out there and brought her to Washington when we actually conceived the Grandy and Andy morning show, which is the format you're looking at now. So she essentially became the producer of what we're doing. And she also, we do a thing at the end of the week called Say That Again, which are the top sound bites and the probably the most memorable sound cues. That was her idea. So she has been a very important part of the content and quality of the show as well.
How often do you not let somebody on the air, and for what reason?
You'd have to ask her, but based on what I know she does every day, she probably allows maybe 30% of the calls through, because there are just some people that don't quite understand the nature of public broadcasting.
WMAL, where people can listen to on the internet, is owned by what company?
Citadel Broadcasting. Citadel is the company that bought all of Disney's radio stations about 3 or 4 years ago. So they own WABC in New York, they own us, they own WJR in Detroit. All of the old line kind of flagship stations in most of our major cities, WLS in Chicago.
From your ratings that you see, are you more popular at certain times of the year?
Yes. Summer is never a good time for radio, because, or at least for talk radio, because people go on vacation. The critical times, the spring book and the fall book. Fall book would be roughly mid-September up until about mid-December. Spring book would be probably mid-April to mid-June. So that's got everything to do with advertising revenue.
That's why you agreed to talk to us in this slow period right now.
Yeah. Had you tried to get me during my busy period, I would have blown you off in a heartbeat.
You talk about your wife and your child. This is your second marriage?
Yes.
And you had one child?
By this marriage,
By
yes.
this marriage. 3 total?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You have names for them. We're going to watch a little bit of it for about 1 minute and 30 seconds and ask you why you do this.
Okay.
This is from my personal file, but it relates to public policy and the news of the day. As I think I've told you Mrs. Fred, who hates to fly, finally relented, said, I've got to go to Detroit because I think I've told you her mom, Grandma Fred, is in hospice, and she wanted to get out there.
Sure.
So she decided she would go out and fly back the same day, and she took Ching Lao with her. Okay, now, I would like to report that in the course of one day and one round-trip flight, Mrs. Fred succeeded in exposing the flaws of airport security domestically and arresting potential terrorist attacks.
Really?
Here's how it happened.
Yes.
She's going through security at Reagan, okay?
Right.
And because it's a one-day trip, she knows she wasn't going to be able to eat, so she and Ching Lao brought some food with them, some of which was a container of applesauce, okay?
Yeah.
The airport security guys stopped her and said, what's this?
Right.
And she said, it's applesauce. He said, I'll be the judge of that. Took a bite, said, yeah, it is applesauce.
The guy tested it?
Meanwhile, Ching Lao goes right through, okay? Same applesauce, same deal.
Oh, no kidding.
They missed the whole thing.
No kidding.
All right. This does not provide a lot of comfort for Mrs. Fred.
Right.
Particularly since she is behind two guys, scruffily dressed, looking somewhat questionable with passports and backpacks.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
So she is so upset, she says to the TSA guys, hey, how about them?
Right.
How about them? And,
Right.
and the TSA guy says, that may not be a bad idea. So the bottom line, two Peruvian divinity students will think twice about getting on an airplane dressed in a scruffy manner.
Okay.
Thanks to Mrs. Fred.
Right.
Your wife has had a career of her own.
Catherine Mann is her real name. Mrs. Fred is her iconic name on the Grandy and Andy Morning Show.
Why do you
with
do
her
that?
with her complete permission, by the way.
Yeah. Why do you do that?
Well, we started out, because we were both in the business when we were first married. She was on Entertainment Tonight as an entertainment journalist and is also a novelist, has written 3 books. And we decided, particularly when we had, our daughter's real name is Monica, it is not Ching Lao. But we decided to do that just so that we wouldn't run afoul of any kind of overzealous fan who might, try to seek us out. The Mrs. Fred thing actually derived from a show I did in Washington quite a few years back now, which was a musical of Great Expectations. And of course, if you know, there's Joe Gargery and Mrs. Joe from the Dickens novel. And I don't know how I got from Mrs. Joe to Mrs. Fred, but I remember first when I got on the air, Catherine and I were talking, and I said, I don't know how much or how little you want me to talk about you, but do you want me to use your name? Do you want me to get into that? And she said, I'm not sure I want you to. So somehow Mrs. Fred just sprang from my imagination one day. And Ching Lao is just a joke because, I wanted to stress that this couldn't possibly be her name. Although I've had people saying, I thought you had adopted a Korean child. And I said, no, actually not. That's just a stage name for my daughter. But my daughter never listens, so she doesn't have any idea what I call her.
Does your wife listen?
Oh, all the time. Oh, yeah, she is scrupulous in her editorial comments on the show. And she's even been on the show. I mean, she occasionally fills in for me.
How long can you keep this up, the 2 a.m.?
That's a very good question, because as much as I like it, I say to myself, over time, this is going to have, I think, some deleterious health consequences. And I like being on radio, but I can't be sure how long I'll be able to sustain morning radio. Morning radio, of course, is prime time in radio still. The drive time is the equivalent of, 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock on TV in the evening. But having said all that, there are periods where I just say, as much fun as this is, I wouldn't say no to a 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock slot in the afternoon sometime.
Any more public office?
For me?
Yes.
I don't really think so, because as much as I enjoyed it, in a way I feel as though I'm kind of closer to the public now. It's interesting, as I see, and I don't think I'm alone in this, as I see Congress kind of distance itself from the public it serves, I see to some degree talk radio and infotainment moving in to fill that gap. It seems to me a lot of people call our program and other programs because they cannot get any kind of a connection with their elected officials. And it's not just members of Congress, it's mayors, it's city council people, county executives. And so I say this based on the communication that I had when I was a member. My fondest memories of being an Iowa congressman were town meetings in communities that might be no larger than 1,000 people. And you would go to the community center and maybe 150 people would show up. So you got 10% of the community right there. And we could easily sustain a 2-hour discussion back and forth. And until talk radio, that was my idea of interactive government.
Last question, your favorite talk show host, other than Andy, or, you're on your own time, who would you listen to first?
The sine qua non is Rush Limbaugh. And it's not because I agree with him on everything, although I think he's usually on point. He's the best broadcaster out there, with the possible exception of Howard Stern. Those two guys are, as far as I'm concerned, the kind of Zeus and Poseidon of talk radio, and I don't think anybody else comes close. I don't know who the heirs apparent are. Glenn Beck is very good, but those two guys are in a class by themselves.
Fred Grandy, we are out of time, and we thank you.
Wow, time sure goes fast when you're having fun.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.